way. So,
Degen, S F B F B F B F Degen. Is that it? Did I get it right?
so hello everyone. We are live. Welcome to Degens for a Brighter Future. My name is Jorge, and I'm here with the man, the myth, the legend. I don't know how tall he is or how much he weighs. He's on the other end of the ring, getting ready for some questions. Mr. Chad Barraford himself. How are you doing today?
I think I need an applause after that kind of introduction there. I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you so much for coming on. And like, what a wonderful week for you to be on too. There's so much going on with Rune. I just have with Thorchain and Thorswap in particular.
Yeah,
It's easy to mix up the two.
yeah.
Uh, but before I get into the nitty gritty, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, this is still a very new industry, and I was very curious. How did you find yourself in this space? Where were you before you came to cryptocurrency?
Well, so before I got into this space, I was just, a software engineer building things for like startups in the Boston area predominantly. I've always been a software engineer for the last like 12 years or so, and I got a little bit like kind of bored of my day-to-day life living in Boston, and so I decided to like sell everything I owned, or almost everything I owned, and then just travel the world for a few years. And in doing so, it kind of was pushed you outside your comfort zone. You meet some new interesting characters, and a couple of guys I met who were interesting characters were Ethereum people. They were like telling about Bitcoin and Ethereum, like all these kind of newfangled technology things, and I thought that was really fascinating. So I decided to really dive into the depths of it from a technological perspective. And I rolled my own blockchain from scratch, actually, when I was living in Lisbon at the time. And I decided I was going to build a blockchain just like as an academic research sandbox thing, just to like, how does this whole thing really work underneath the hood? Like, if you want to know how a car works, like you can get a book and read about it, but like getting your hands dirty, getting your hands like, filled with grease in a sense, and actually putting together a carburetor is probably like a really great way to really understand the mechanics at play. And so I did that. And once I did that, I was just like, wow, this thing is earth shattering. This is one of the most important technological innovations of the last 100 years. And it can really significantly reshape this planet, like on the level of the internet, reshape the world, like at that kind of level, like that kind of severity, how it can really restructure the entire planet and how we operate as people.
That's awesome. I mean, for me, I what I find so emboldening about cryptocurrency is this level of freedom that we haven't really touched before.
Yeah.
That's actually a big reason why I'm a huge Thorchain bull. By the way, for anyone watching, nothing in this video is financial advice, maybe financial opinion. Do your own research. We're just guys on the internet talking about magic internet money, not that cryptocurrency. Anyways, moving on. So the next thing I wanted to ask you, just diving back into this level of freedom, where you are sort of your own sovereign bank and sovereign financial entity. And I was curious, so what was the kind of clicking moment that kind of brought all these random developers to make Thorchain, and what was the ethos behind this?
Yeah. So the first attempt at building Thorchain was done in 2018. And so money was raised, not a whole lot, but just a little bit was raised. A dev team was put together, and in the end, it didn't work out so well. And that's largely because special signatures didn't exist yet. Cosmos wasn't like quite a thing yet. And so this like the technology wasn't like quite there to make it viable at that time. But then in 2019, I met this guy at a hackathon in Berlin as a Cosmos hackathon. And so he invited me to meet him out at this hackathon thing. We could, just spend 2 days together, just hacking on something and see what happens. And so we got together and like, so, what should we build here? And he's like, well, I had this idea I was messing around with last year that it didn't work out, but it's really cool. It's kind of the idea of like swapping between chains. Why don't we just work on this for a couple of days? I'm like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. let's do this, right? Like, and so we hacked on it for a couple of days, got something like almost semi-functional in a short period of time. And we ended up winning the hackathon, I think, like we're one of the finalists at least, or something like this. Won some free Atom tokens or something like this. But that was like that's when it kind of got rebirthed, right? And so a week later or 2 weeks later, the BEP2 token was launched on Binance Dex, because I think actually Raven, a different token that's I don't think is really around too much anymore, but Raven had launched like a week or two earlier, proving that you could launch a token like in an IDO, like one of the earlier forms of an IDO. So in my opinion, that's true. And so that kind of showed like, oh, you can actually raise some money, you can actually launch a token pretty easily without a lot of work, and then you can like get things kind of going. So from there, that was when it all kind of re-kicked off, and off to the races we were.
That's amazing. It's nuts how you can just meet random people and suddenly magic happens.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, as the project grew, did it become somewhat philosophical? Was there a discussion of like, yeah, we don't need anyone else to gain access to this network? Or was it just kind of organically building this, as you mentioned earlier, sort of thesis, if you will, like thesis of blockchain, and it just kind of evolved into that?
I think from the beginning, there was just this mentality of the importance of decentralization, the importance of censorship resistance, of being permissionless. And I feel like we kind of lose that in this industry, like especially in the DeFi space, we kind of like forget about these things, decentralization. Like we flock to, Binance Smart Chain, for example, which is obviously not decentralized at all, right? And we flock to these DeFi protocols that are secured by a multi-sig, and I feel like we kind of sometimes forget these things, which is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, because it kind of misses the core fundamentals of what we're trying to do here as an industry. But I think we always felt from the beginning that this thing was going to be decentralized from the beginning. We saw at the time that like other protocols, like Ren protocol, for example, they ran all the nodes internally, and which is inherently problematic from our perspective. And so we wanted to, like, when we launched this thing for the first time, even in single chain chaosnet, which is like our pre-beta alpha version of this, even that was, permissionless and actually launched, and everybody could run a node. We made that decision very early on. We wanted to do that. So we were strong from the beginning about the ethos. We knew this thing could be very important, very big for the industry. And I think from my own understanding, like as time went on, I kind of realized how significant it would be. It just became more and more obvious to me of how this could reshape the industry in a significant way.
Absolutely. I mean, when we were on Twitter Spaces, I told you how strongly I felt about that. I think there is, especially right now, with what seems to be the collapse of CeFi, kind of, this might be a great segue. So there's obviously a lot of talks about regulation, but before we get into regulation, I was curious, what are your thoughts on sort of these CeFi platforms like Celsius and BlockFi? And we've seen that they have, I guess for lack of a better word, seem to have been Degens. See what I did there? And with other people's funds. So what are your thoughts on the centralized platforms in particular? And my next question is that I know we either are moving into mainnet, and I was hoping we could segue after that into the single-sided yield and how exactly that's going to work.
Sure. So first things first, the CeFi stuff question. So one of the funny things I don't think most people realize about like centralized finance or just traditional finance is that it's born into a system where you don't have like Darwinism. Like there's so many mechanisms that governments or people have to like push their thumb on the scale, right? And to manipulate the outcome, like bailouts is a good example of that. And like capital control is another example of that. Like ways of forcing people in one way or another to make an economic system work, even though it inherently does not, right? Like Lehman Brothers, and Fannie Mae and all this stuff, like in 2008, this big giant collapse happened. And then this big giant bailout happened. And rather than letting things die as a nature more or less intends, we as a country, I guess we felt that we should make it work. So CeFi, what we're seeing now in some sense is that that they're used to doing things in a way that is not economically solvent, right? They kind of rely on certain things not happening, cross your fingers, in order to make sure that things like are stay level-headed, right? Like Terra collapsing, for example, is probably a big hit to Three Arrows and Celsius. Like they became lost all their their funds, blah blah blah, and like that became, I'm sure, a big issue for them. I wish them the best on that kind of thing, but I'm sure that was a big problem for them. And so those things will either sink or they'll swim, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what I love about DeFi is that, like, over CeFi, is that like everything either sinks or swims. There's no, for the most part, there's no bailout. Sometimes there are, like, Wormhole got exploited, and I think Jump Capital or Jump, whatever it's called, like came in and spent $300-something million to save it, blah, blah, blah. But like, generally speaking, that doesn't happen. Things just kind of collapse. Like even when Terra collapsed, like Terra didn't just collapse, like a lot of things collapsed, like other DeFi protocols on other platforms and other ecosystems simultaneously collapsed at the same time because they had designed and built themselves on top of other systems that didn't have solid footing itself, being Terra in this particular example. So those systems will just go ahead and die, but CeFi, it may not. It may have just grab some new investors, call bankruptcy or something like this to like refinance like there's positions, all these things that like we don't really have in the DeFi space, nor should we, in my opinion, right? So I don't think CeFi is dead. I think they're going through a hard time. So is DeFi, for that matter, too. Like everything's being hit pretty hard right now. But CeFi will continue to exist. Like BlockFi will continue to exist. Celsius will probably, refinance or find some mechanisms to kind of like stay on their feet and come back. And I hope they do. Like they're not a bad company, right? They're not like they're doing something malicious or something. Like they're just trying to provide yield for people and another mechanism. So free market will do the free market does, and I support anybody experimenting with what they want to experiment with. So I'm excited to see how this thing's kind of pan out, but I don't think it's the death of CeFi. I think it's just a momentary struggle. Then they'll come back, I'm sure.
Of course. And then the next thing I wanted to ask, there's, man, wow, you said so much there. Okay, one thing at a time. Thing at a time. No, it's totally fine. I love the train of thought here. It's phenomenal. So I know I asked you about the single-sided staking, but I gotta go back to one thing you mentioned. You brought up the wormhole bridge, if I'm correct, and that was a huge hack. And fortunately, as I understand it, Sam Bankman-Fried came in and brought liquidity back into that smart contract, and then they were able to move Ethereum back in Solana and back into ETH. So one interesting thing is, Vitalik Buterin said in a tweet, the world will be multi-chain but not cross-chain. Obviously, Rune is definitely the opposite of that. So I'm curious if you were sitting with him in a room right now, and you probably have several times, I'm sure. And I don't know if you've ever had this discussion, but what would be your response to this cross-chain dilemma in his case?
Well, so for Vitalik's perspective, if I understand correctly, which I hope I do, is one that aligns with the Thorchain ethos, right? And he basically says that like wrapped assets are inherently problematic for a host of reasons. I talk about how they're problematic because they always require trust in order for them to operate and function, which is inherently problematic from my perspective. And he talks about the idea of like, what we sometimes refer to, not to get too technical, but like a two-phase commit problem, where like you have two sources of data and one can be manipulated and the other one not. And then you get into this like disagreement of what the state is. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, we have this many tokens of BDC, like layer one BDC, and then we have like this many of this wrap BDC on Solana or like whatever it might be. And then that becomes, oh, now we have like a disagreement of state. And that becomes, if that potential exists, the potential will occur just like naturally at some point in time through bugs, exploits, who knows what, right? So they inherently are quite problematic in many respects. And so I've actually never talked to Vitalik. I mean, I'd love to one day, and maybe that'll happen. But like everything he says about this space completely aligns with the ethos of Thorchain. And if I had to take a guess, my guess, and I don't know this, I'm just spitballing here. So don't quote me, but like, he's probably actually a big fan of Thorchain, but just won't admit it publicly because he's like the CEO, so to speak, or at least he was, of Ethereum. And like, for him to say that publicly would probably cause, some strife for him. Like, because there are a lot of people in the ETH maxi world who like hate Thorchain because it's not Ethereum, and
Right.
and so like, he doesn't really come out very much to like publicly support projects outside of that ethos. It's like, I haven't noticed it, at least not personally. And so my guess is that he's actually a fan of it, because actually it's like exactly what he's been asking for, almost to a T. And so I'd be shocked if it wasn't. Like, if he had a problem with it, I would love to hear what that is. Like, and I would love to have that conversation even publicly. I'd be happy to have that conversation. Like, I would love to see it. But my guess is that he actually is a fan of it, just because it aligns everything with what he's been saying for the last 2-3 years on the topic.
I may have to make this a clip and then flood it on the internet till hopefully he finds it. I think that would be an awesome video.
I got some mutual friends with him, and I've been like hesitant to like poke my mutual friend, to poke him, and just to get like some, a backroom conversation of like, what's happening? Like, what do you think? What do you think of the design?
To the dismay of maybe others, if that clip was supposedly on the internet, but maybe it could be over a beer, and maybe I'll follow up with you later and you can talk about it. So the next question I wanted to ask you, there is definitely been a liquidity crunch, both in the CeFi world, but also in the DeFi world. There have been several hacks. Actually, 25 minutes ago, my group was going a little nuts because I don't know if you saw, there was a hack on the Horizon bridge on Harmony. So kudos, I really hope that they figure that out.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. By the way, like getting hacked, just speaking from personal experience, is like the worst.
That's a great segue.
Yeah.
Well, actually, how about this? Instead of the question I was going to ask, Thorchain has been hacked in the past. What was that experience like? And then what did you and sort of the other developers in the group learn? And whatever you can say is making Thorchain more secure moving forward?
Yeah, so like, we got a couple of exploits in the earliest days of our public beta. And we knew that was a potential, which is why we launched it as ChaosNet and not mainnet to begin with. We knew that there was this potential because the surface area of attack of Thorchain is far and above almost every other DeFi protocol in the space, like extremely so. And so there's a lot of different surface areas, so we had to be much more cautious and kind of measured about how we approach these things. But we went through the process of like, single chain, and we went through the process of some audits. We did the process of internal testing and simulations. We did everything we could reasonably think we could think of before we actually launched the thing. And then we limited the amount of capital in there. I think we started with like, I think it was like $3 or $5 million total in the network on day one, whatever it was. And slowly over time, we kind of like inched it up. Getting exploited is always like the worst nightmare, right? Like, it's like, it is the thing that you always know is a possibility, and it will always be a possibility. There'll never be a day in Thorchain's past, present, or future where there's no possibility of exploit, right? You have to admit that. Like, even Bitcoin was like, had a huge like infinite mint bug 10 years after it launched, like back in like things like 2018, I think, or something like this. Like, they had an actual way of infinitely minting Bitcoin. And so like, wow, even that chain that's been around for over 10 years and has 800 contributors to that code base, the Bitcoin core code base, has, bugs. Like, even today, there's still bugs in Bitcoin, right? Like, it's just a natural thing of software engineering. So you always have to be aware of it, and you have to be, cautious of it, and think about those things. And like, so that's something we always are thinking about ourselves. And so when we did get exploited, like, we learned a bunch from that experience, right? And I certainly learned a bunch, even on a personal level, of like how to structure these things going forward. So the big takeaways for me on that experience was bug bounties are like super important, right? And we always had a bug bounty, but we just didn't publicize it well. I didn't even realize how important it was to publicize a bug bounty, so that like, you want to let all the white hats know that like, hey, here's a bunch of, money, find an exploit, blah, 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 like incentivize the right people to get involved. I don't think we did that well enough in the earliest days of that public beta.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we did wrong was the audits that we did have, and we spent almost like over like close to $1 million or maybe over $1 million. I don't know the exact number of dollars. And we did like, I think like 6 or 7 audits or something like this. Of different, like some were economic, some were infrastructure, some were like, the code, like some cryptographic, right? Like there was a bunch of different audits done. But like in all of those audits, we learned almost nothing from them as a project. Like none of them actually had anything of significant value to like, oh, hey, there's a problem here, you should fix this thing. I mean, they found like a bunch of like informational or like low severity things that like, wouldn't really be a big deal. And like, yeah, we patched a few of them, but like they were just like, if we didn't patch them, I'd probably be okay with that. Like to some degree, they were like, they were very low level. And so what I learned from my experience is that like hiring audits are not as effective as people think that they are. They're oftentimes, and I'm not saying any specific companies or whatever, but like oftentimes they can be just rubber stamps, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you're just like, you're paying for the rubber stamp rather than the actual like audit itself, right? I felt like sometimes they were just like, oh, we ran it through some linters, some like security linters, and we found a couple of small things, and that was more or less it. And I was just like, that was not very helpful whatsoever. But so what we did do that actually was very helpful in this regard was that we built a dedicated security team, which we call Thorsec. And Thorsec is comprised of multiple people who've been in this DeFi space, banging on protocols for years and very successful at doing so. I was talking to one of those guys, and he was saying how like he generally works like 2 months a year because he spends 2 months, hacking on some, protocol or something like this, finds some exploit, gets paid a bunch of money, and then like, shoves off for the next 10 months. That's kind of how he's like used to operate, but now he's got like basically a full-time job. And so he's constantly hacking on the code in the sense he's like, every code change that happens in the network is now being continuously audited by a dedicated team whose, their reputation to some extent is on the line. And they have a detailed and deep understanding of that code base. And they actually know exactly how, things work and function and operate. So that's much more effective. If you want to get like audits done, like I would push any DeFi team, like hire your own dedicated Thorsec team or security team to be like, and hire good people, which is hard to do. That's like the hardest part of it all, finding really good talent. That's really key. And then the last thing I learned that I think was very valuable for myself and for others is that like, you can go through all the code you want. You can hire, your own Thorsec team. You can do audits. You can do this all the live long day. But in the end, you don't know whether or not you found all the bugs or not, right? Or you don't know if you found all the exploits or not. There could be more, right? You never know if you will. It's a known unknown. You know that you don't know it, right? So what I realized was instead of trying to find all the bugs, of course you still do that, of course, not you don't do that, but instead of relying on that aspect, you build these like kind of short circuits or these layers of like iron curtains in a matter of speaking, that if somebody were to find an attack vector in some way that myself or other people have not been able to think of, then the network would protect itself in real time from that attacker, right? That's a much more effective tool because if you can't rely on me finding every bug because I probably won't, right? And neither will any security team or any developer. That's just how software engineering itself works in general. And so you build these kind of like blanketed protections to kind of protect the network from happening, which actually happened, right, on multiple occasions. Like even when Terra started to collapse, the network detected the unreliability of the Terra chain and paused itself autonomously.
Wow.
To protect itself from getting into a weird state where it couldn't get an idea of like what was actually happening on the Terra blockchain, like were transactions sent or not, were funds coming in or not. Like it had a hard time getting it, like this is like unreliable here. This is not acting the way it should. Let's pause it. Let's halt it. Until like humans can come by and like analyze it and figure out what's going on. So that was like that actually worked right in real time, right? And actually protect the network autonomously. That's a big deal in my mind.
No, that's fantastic. And I was actually planning to ask you about that experience. I suppose if you want to go into more nuance with it, I mean, obviously the Luna UST launch for Thorchain was a big deal. It was slated for a long time. And, I'll be honest, I was very lucky and I sold my Luna at a very high price and I walked away. Nothing against it, lost interest. But what was that experience like, especially from a PR standpoint? How was it like communicating with the community and also having to deal with this bomb that I feel maybe the maxis I should have listened to a little bit more at the time, and whatever the case may be, what was the experience like?
So we had launched Doge first before Terra, only because it's like a fork of Bitcoin and it was relatively easy to implement. And we already built the code like months and months and months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And what we learned from that experience is that like just launching a chain with a high market cap, like Doge has, but has no engagement or no interest in like the DeFi space. Like Doge people, and generally speaking, are not DeFi people. They don't have access to DeFi. They've never used DeFi before. And all they read every other day on the news is like, oh, another thing exploited, another 300 million, 120 million, 250 million. Like that's all they hear. And they get very nervous about that stuff. And so the Doge launch, in my opinion, wasn't even that successful. Even today, it's got like less than $6 million or $4 million in pool depth, which is not that much, right?
Right.
And so on the other side of that spectrum was Terra, where we got the Terra community kind of learning about Thorchain and Rune and what it does and why it does and how it's valuable to the Terra community. We got the Thorchain community learning about Terra and what they do and why what they're doing is valuable, blah, blah, blah. And get those two communities to like be synergistic and come together. And we had like Twitter spaces, we had like talks, we had all these things. And so when we actually did launch Terra, there was just like a cacophony of voices kind of rejoicing in the sense. And like the token price went up, we got $100 million in the pools, the bond got deeper, the trade volume increased, like every metric across the board just like went up like crazy, right? Which was awesome.
Yeah.
Like to me, like Terra is like the new standard of how we should launch new chains, idealistically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And so unfortunately it didn't work out in the long run because Terra had some issues, but like that was a really successful launch. And it did what we hope each launch does, which is to like get an entire new community to be aware of like Rune and Thorchain and like expand our own community. Every time we add a new community, we should be expanding our own. We want to get those people doing it. So like, even like you talk about a chain like Dash, for example, like a lot of people don't like Dash. Like they're just, call it quote unquote a shitcoin, but the Dash community loves Thorchain. The Dash community is a big fan of it. So like when we add Dash to the network at some point in time, like that's going to be very successful for the network. Even if like detach yourself from what you think or feel about that particular chain or particular asset, it doesn't really matter. In reality, you're getting more trade volume, you're getting more pool depth to the pools, you're getting more liquidity. Like that should be a thing. It doesn't matter if it's Dash. It doesn't matter if it's like, even if it's Dash, like you're still going to get more trade volume on the Bitcoin pool and the Ethereum pool because people are going to swap from Dash to Bitcoin or Dash to Ethereum or Dash to Tether or whatever. So all of the pools will just naturally increase in trade volume. So, if you kind of drop the pitchfork in a sense and just say like, we'll add things that people will really want to see happen. Mm-hmm. And Dash is one of those things. Haven is one of those things, hopefully Monero is one of those things too. And like, Gaia, Avalanche.
I actually did write on this. I didn't even write it very thoughtfully. I just wrote when XMR because I am a big XMR fan, and I love the concept that probably in most countries you'll be able to buy Bitcoin, but being able to be like XMR adds that layer of sovereign wealth. If you can take your Bitcoin, switch it on Rune, go XMR, there's this beauty where you're able to be a sovereign individual and essentially have digital cash on hand wherever you need to go. And that's your business, no one else's. And for me, that's a big thing with runes. So I'm
Yeah.
actually pretty excited that you brought that up. I do recall on a Twitter Spaces that there were some difficulties in terms of bit size
Yes.
with XMR, if that's
Yes.
correct. I was told that one of the key mechanisms to bring XMR onto Thorchain is the implementation of Thor names. And I could be wrong, by the way, but I was
Yeah.
hoping you could dive into that a little bit and
Right.
where you guys are as far as working on bringing XMR into Thorchain or Monero. I say XMR, but it's Monero, ladies and gentlemen,
Right.
just in case
Yeah.
for those of you that don't know.
Yeah. So part of the issue with Monero, and there's many of them, but we're working hard to solve these problems, is
Mhm.
that a Monero address or a crypto node address, any crypto node based chain, I think it's like 97 bytes or 98 bytes, something like this, or 99 bytes, something like this. And the maximum memo size of a Bitcoin transaction is 80 bytes, right? And so like, there's just not enough space within that Bitcoin, memo to put a full, XMR address, along with like, I want to swap and I want to swap to Monero, and this is my swap limit, blah, blah, all those additional pieces of little bits of data. So that kind of constitutes a problem for us because we want people to be able to swap in a single transaction without needing to go through additional hoops and stuff. And the way that we kind of solve this is the best of our ability to operate within the confines of these external chains, is Thor names. And so you can create a short, 10 character or 5 character or even 2 character, alias to your XMR address.
Mhm.
And so now you can put all the data you need to into a Bitcoin transaction without needing to make a separate like making a Bitcoin transaction and then also making a separate transaction on Thorchain, which means you need to hold both a rune address and a Bitcoin address, which could be problematic for some people who don't want to hold rune, which is perfectly fine. We've designed it in a way that you don't have to hold rune, but everything you do accrues value to it. So there's lots of challenges with Monero. Being a private chain is inherently problematic because the community needs to come to a consensus on what transactions are happening. This address sent us this much amount of XMR, right? And we sent out that much. And having that clarity of like knowing publicly what happened on a rig signature or privacy chain, obviously those 2 things kind of don't really coalesce very well. And so we have to do all sorts of new engineering to kind of like be able to decipher what's happening on Monero to understand what's happening, so that the nodes can reach a consensus that, oh yeah, we did receive XMR from this address and so that we can actually do what we do.
Well, I think you're the guys to do it. So you got my vote. I'm faithful. So
we are half the team to do it because we've relied on Haven, who are crypto node experts. I'm not a crypto node expert myself, right? Like I don't know that chain in deep detail, how it works from a technological or cryptographic perspective, other than a high level understanding. And so the technical expertise of like the Haven team has been really helpful to help us develop the crypto node implementation of the chain client, so that we can integrate Monero and other
privacy focused coins.
and other
Right.
privacy focused tokens. Yeah.
So now moving I wanted to go back to a question I tried asking you earlier, but there's just so much to unpack here. But getting back to what we were speaking about earlier. So now one of the big challenges in DeFi 2 is yield, and there's a lot of liquidity being drained. One of the things that shocked me was seeing Bancor remove their impermanent loss protection. I'm very interested in knowing on your end. So how is Thorchain able to do this during the crunch? Are there foreseeable challenges in the future concerning the impermanent loss protection? And then how sustainable are the yields in the farms, and also the yields on the future single-sided staking, which if XMR is on there? I'll be excited. All right, let's go on.
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah.
So ILP is an interesting concept, and to my knowledge, there's only 2 protocols that actually do it, and that's Thorchain and Bancor are the only ones that actually do it. Everybody else just like say you're on your own, and if you lose, you lose, and that's the kind of the mentality. In Thorchain's case, the reason why we could do it is because the slip-based model that we utilize for determining fees is just highly effective and efficient to generate good yield for LPs. And so after a year or two of economic, real world data, we found that, it's only like less than maybe 1% or maybe less than 1% of people actually experience IL after 100 days. And so like it's a feature we kind of provide as a protocol, but like it's rarely actually executed on or utilized, right? It gives you that kind of sense of like, oh, I have this.
Hello, Chad, are you there? Chad?
Hey, George, he's freeze for
Just
me
kind of
too.
backstop in case things go, nobody will actually use it. Very small. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Oh,
Hello?
yes. Sorry. Your screen froze. Do you mind if? Oh, hello.
Hello, can you see me or hear me okay?
Yes. Sorry, there
Sure.
was a disconnection. Do you mind? Forgive me. Could you start over? Technical error. Oh, is that happening again? Oh man. Chad, are you there?
Yeah, sure, no worries. Yes, you still there?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry.
There
Sorry
you
for the
are.
technical issues.
It's back.
Do you
No
mind if you
worries, no
could jump
worries.
back into that?
Yeah, of course. So impermanent loss protection is something that only two protocols actually support, to my knowledge, are Thorchain and Bancor. And the reason why we feel like we could do is because the slip-based model is very efficient and effective at producing yield that 99% of the time you won't even experience IL to begin with after 100 days, which is largely true. What's happening now, though, is because of the downturn in the market, that the amount of impermanent loss liability in terms of the protection has gone up quite significantly relative to where it was before. It's still relatively low. It's only at like, I think like maybe 2% of the reserve. Like it's still a very small percentage. But in my opinion, I don't think it'll be a real problem in the long term, because you only see in a downward spike in the movement. But as soon as you flatten out and you kind of go sideways, which is typically what happens in most bear cycles, like you have this sharp downward angle and then you just kind of have this flat or sideways action. During that time, you're just generating more and more yield, which is just counteracting the permanent loss that you're experiencing before, right? So, and the vast majority of people who are experiencing IL aren't going to leave anyway because they want to continue to earn the yield anyways. So it's not something that I'm terribly concerned about. It's something we should keep an eye on for sure, and just kind of keep our finger on the pulse. But I don't see any reason for Thorchain to be pausing it or removing it as Baker has decided to do.
Of course. And then I guess the next segue I wanted to do, I think I've noticed on Twitter a lot of confusion about the single-sided yield. I was hoping you could elaborate on how exactly that's going to work.
Sure. So this is one of like the holy grails we've been thinking about on the team since almost the beginning, right? Like, and it became even more apparent how important this feature was because we were talking to, big whales and institutions and whatnot, and trying to get them to provide liquidity and be engaged and this kind of stuff. And for many of them, they didn't want to do it because they didn't want to sell off half their Bitcoin into, Rune and then take on that price exposure. And then that's inherently problematic for them. Especially if you think about like a Celsius or a BlockFi, they're taking people's Bitcoin. Those people want to earn more Bitcoin on their Bitcoin, and they don't want people to sell off half that Bitcoin into Rune to provide us capital into this network, right? Which is totally legitimate. Like I feel the same way if I was them. So we thought about it for a while, and originally we were going to do like a loan from the treasury. So we would like for big whales or big institutions, we would like give them a loan from the treasury, our own wallets in a sense, of the treasury wallets more accurately.
Mhm.
And then give them a loan for a number of rune, which they pay us back later, probably even interest free, just to get them to provide capital, and we get our rune back later. But that became really problematic because it's like, oh, they have to figure out like how you do custody, like Fireblock doesn't support rune yet. And, you know, it's been like a 12-month contract deal, and it's just, you know, it's a lot of like headaches and due diligence, and it just was a problem. So then we realized we could do it on chain instead, and just have the protocol itself be the kind of counterparty to this. And so effectively what happens is that somebody provides Bitcoin, like layer 1 BTC, and then it gets swapped into synthetic BTC, which is backed by the pool itself. And that BTC is like locked in. Like you don't get, there's no IL in this context. When you hold a synthetic, you hold the actual asset. There's no rune exposure, and so you just hold the asset, the synthetic asset itself. And so as you do that, the LPs take on a risk, right? The more synthetics there are for a given pool relative to its depth, or we call it synth utilization, the LPs take on like a leveraged rune position. So if rune performs well, they make a lot more money. And if rune does not perform well relative to asset, then they make a little bit less money in terms of their yield. It's a little bit asymmetric. It's actually asymmetric to the upside rather than the down. But that's because of swap fees. But like that's effectively how it works. And we didn't want to, you know, get to like a 50% utilization or 80% utilization, because that would just be too much leverage. Like it would just wreck people, like wreck the LPs, which obviously
Right.
we don't want to do that. So how do you get around this problem? Well, the network itself, the protocol itself, can take a long-term perspective on the rune asset and be a long-term kind of holder, like diamond hands, kind of thing, right? Like it will never sell because it has no interest to sell, right? Like it has no interest to become a billionaire because it's a network. It has no interest in making money per se, just doing the job of holding the token. So like it can think on a multi-year landscape. So it can take a hit in the short term of like some bear market, but it knows over the long term it's going to perform very well of the rune asset over the time span of like 3, 4, 5 years. And so it can do that and then make the benefit from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the reserve comes in, the network's protocol comes in and provides capital into the pools to counteract the effectiveness of that leveraged rune position that the LPs are taking, right? And so the LPs are taking on no more risk than they are today, but it allows for anybody to just deploy just Bitcoin or just Ethereum or just Monero, sure, and provide a yield on that without any IL, without any losses. You always have your principal, and you always get some sort of yield on top of that principal, whatever you end up putting in. And so that kind of like simplicity and that clarity is like infinitesimally important, right? Because now you don't have to understand, oh, what's a pool and what's the assets and what's this thing of swapping between this and what's the IL thing and what's the fee thing. Like you don't actually have to understand all that stuff. Not just like, oh, I put in Bitcoin and I get more Bitcoin. And it's like, there's not much else to think about other than that for the most part. So like, that's a critically huge thing to the market. And so as soon as we launch this feature, my feeling is that like we will get massive quantities of Bitcoin and other assets just like dumped into the network, into the pools. And the pools will get very deep, very, very fast. Even in a bear market, I think that's probably going to happen. This is my 2 cents.
You know, it's interesting because one of the things that institutions like a lot is yield. You know, and essentially, you know, although there's a ton of skepticism in this ambient sphere at the moment, we are where I think there is what I think might happen. Especially, this can be done successfully with stablecoins, perhaps Haven. Is that if people can somehow save their capital or increase their exposure to their capital in a bear market, you know, and sufficiently, then that is a good use case for Rune in the long term.
Yes.
So the next thing I wanted to ask, although it's been all over Twitter like crazy, everyone's talking about Avalanche and Cosmos, and so what I'm really interested in, and I would love you to speak to both. To both assets, obviously, and kind of your experience with each. But I'm very curious with Cosmos, that's the layer of the IBC. Does this mean that it's kind of a given that in the future we might see Osmo, Juno, secret or and other Cosmo network chains to be integrated? Is that going to be a community effort, or is that going to be easily done through the IBC? How
Yeah.
exactly is this going to work?
That's actually a good question that's, I think, unanswered at this time, right? Like, I can totally see us adding more Cosmos chains, but because of IBC, maybe there's not as much of a need to do so, right? So you could, in theory, use Atom as your way in and out of the Cosmos ecosystem into Ethereum and Bitcoin and Doge and Monero and whatever else. But once you have Atom in the Cosmos ecosystem, then you use IBC to get to asset A or asset B on chain D or whatever. It's not so much that Thorchain has to be, the only bridge in existence. It's just one of the bridges, right? And so whether or not we add Osmosis, for example, or Juno or any of the other ones, that's up to the community to decide whether that makes sense or not. I think what we would like to see happening as soon as we get Gaia going is allow it so that people can actually swap to any asset from any asset. So like you can start with Bitcoin and then get Osmo token or get Juno token, right? Even though we've only integrated with the Gaia blockchain, the Atom blockchain, you can still get to that point you get in a single transaction, right? That's still possible to happen. So like, instead of us, that network sending you Atom tokens, and then you take that Atom token, and then you do another transaction somewhere else, we can set it up so that, our network, instead of transferring Atom tokens to some address, it uses an IBC connection to send it into a pool, which then gets swapped to Osmo token or Juno or, whatever it is, Stargate or like whatever it might be, Stargaze. And then it goes out to some address that you want to receive it on the other side of the world, whatever the hell that is. And that all is done in a single transaction, right? And it can go and theoretically can go the other direction as well. Like you can start with, a transaction on Juno to go to Osmosis, swap it to Atom. The Atom gets sent into Thorchain. Thorchain gets the Atom and swaps it to BDC, and the BDC goes out to some BC1 address on the other side, of the transaction. All from your perspective is like a single transaction, but behind the scenes there's lots of complexity happening, right?
Right. No, and I appreciate the clarity. That's also a really good point, because the IBC chains are already very interoperable.
Yeah. So
by using the IBC in general. So
unless we have a problem with IBC itself, which I don't have a problem with IBC itself, right? In terms of how it's built or designed per se. Maybe that's just all we need to do, like to make the change we want to see. But it's up to the community. If the community wants to add Juno directly, or wants to add Osmosis, or wants to add Sif chain, or wants to add any of the other, Cosmos chains, Kava, whatever, they can do that. It's actually not that hard. We got Gaia working. The rest of them are relatively easy. It's just copying and pasting the code for the most part.
Don't get me too excited. All right. So, and now the next thing I wanted to ask, it's really exciting that Avalanche is coming on chain. Avalanche has so much volume, so much liquidity, and I'm really excited. I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about the experience of Avalanche. Like, how did that work out? Was it through the community, or was it sort of like you're at a bar, there's this guy from Avalanche, hey, what's up, man? I love your stuff. How did that work out?
Well, not so much the bar thing. I haven't actually met anybody from Avalanche, in person at least. I've been we were in a few Telegram groups here and there, but like, yeah, I think like for us, we wanted to add an EVM chain that was like fast and low fee. Avalanche is, arguably one of the best ones out there, right?
Right.
At least in my opinion, that's true. And we reached out to them and started a conversation, and it took us a while to convince them to some degree, because I think they weren't quite familiar with Thorchain, at least not initially. And they originally saw it as like, oh, just another bridge like Wormhole. And it's just like, well, no, it's actually structurally very, very different than that. And we had to took some time to kind of get them to understand those aspects. But then we're also starting to work with some of the dexes in that ecosystem to like integrate with Thorchain using that whole dex aggregation feature we've been working on, that will be coming out in the next like week or two. And so like they will be able to have access to Bitcoin and Doge and Chainlink and, you know, whatever, like LUSD, like any random long tail asset on their ecosystem to trade with. Like that's insane to me. Like to have a DEX have access to more or less every asset in the at least 98% or 95% of the liquidity of the entire crypto industry is like melts my brain, right? Like these other DEXs will probably have access to more liquidity and more assets than Coinbase does or Binance does, or
Right.
you know, because all of those things are just like heavily fragmented, right? They're all this fragmented liquidity amongst themselves, and they have their own liquidity pools they have within themselves. But now we're building a DEX aggregation in a way that like you not only have access to all the assets, but you have access to all the liquidity as well, right? And you can utilize all the liquidity of all those different DEXs. In fact, you can use several different DEXs simultaneously, right? Like you can have two different DEXs on Ethereum, one's Uni, one's Sushi, and split your trade into two trades that gets like synced between both of them simultaneously to use the liquidity on both of those assets, basically both of those DEXs, to be able to provide you the resulting, you know, trade at the most efficient perspective possible, right? Whatever that means from a gas or whatnot, or fee perspective. Like that is amazing, because now you can just like, you're actually combining all the fragmented liquidity of the different ecosystems, like in different DEXs within an ecosystem. You're actually collecting them all together and like having them be existing as like one gigantic liquidity pool for like the entire industry.
Wow.
Like that is unifying liquidity on a scale that we've never, not only have we never seen, but I would argue that nobody would tell you that that's a reasonable thing to happen even a year ago. If you would tell people that like a year ago, they'd be like, no, that's not going to happen. Like there's no way that could happen. But like here we are, and now we're actually building this thing. And so like you can actually combine all that liquidity from all those different DEXs and potentially even sexes, even that's even theoretically possible as well. Like to combine together to create like one of the largest liquidity trading platforms in aggregate that the world has ever seen.
I mean, wow. Okay, I'm definitely gonna have to rewatch some of that again and again. I'm a little mind blown. Like, but just the idea of one gigantic place where so much liquidity goes through. But in many ways, I think it's not too far off. I think especially, and I guess this would be a great segue to the next point, or the next question rather. So we're seeing a lot going on. We're definitely in a bear market, and very curious to hear. There's a lot going on with the SEC. There's the new Loomis bill. There seems to be a lot going on with regulation, and for me, I pray that I could just use Thorchain, never have to deal with nothing against Coinbase or FTX or being sponsored by either of them. Heyo, but having that decentralized structure and being able to readily, swap through these coins without having someone in between is, in my opinion, an imperative to the industry. So,
sure.
Have you guys ever been? I don't know if you're allowed to talk about this, but are you guys concerned about regulation in any way? Have you been approached or anything like that yet?
No, I personally have not had any conversations with any regulators. It's an interesting question. I'm actually like, I don't think that regulation makes sense in this space. It makes sense in traditional finance for a host of reasons, right? Because there's so much lateral movement that a corporation can make to be able to manipulate people, trades, rug pulls in the traditional finance sense of things, theft. Like I have a fraternal twin brother, like I'm a twin myself. I have a fraternal twin brother. He works in regulatory finance, actually, believe it or not.
Really?
kind of comical. But like he's told me like he's done investigations and he's like he's gone to court and like testified that this guy at this investment firm did this thing, blah, blah, blah. And like, he's told me these stories of like the things that he's uncovered of people doing shady shit in the traditional finance world and like manipulating, stealing people's 401ks and like all sorts of horrible shit, right? Happens like more or less all the time. And because those people have so many degrees of freedom, they can go ahead and do those things. They can go ahead and steal people's 401ks like that. There's nothing really stopping them other than like, a fear of being arrested or whatever. And oftentimes, here's a comical thing. Oftentimes, those people who steal those funds and they get caught and they get like go through court and the whole process, in the end, they pay a fine. They don't go to jail, they pay a fine. And oftentimes that fine is less than the money they actually stole. Isn't that crazy? Look combined. It's like insane. But in this space, it's different, right? In this space, it's quite different. So in a DeFi protocol, there's no degrees of latitude. You already know, because everything's open source, what the degrees of latitude are. It's clearly documented for the entire world to see, right? This is why open source code is one of the most effective means of regulation just on itself, because everybody knows who can do what. Is there a multi-sig? What powers does Chad have? Can he steal the funds or not, or blah, blah, blah. All this information is like clearly documented and clearly verifiable. And so because of that, like, you don't need to put any regulations on me and as an individual, because like, what can I do? I can't do anything. Like, I have no ability to take funds or to manipulate outcomes or like any of these kind of things, right? And so like, you only need to put these systems in place when people can abuse systems in a covert and like black box kind of way, which is what we see in TradFi all the time. My brother could probably tell you all about it, right? But in this space, it's different. Like you know exactly what's happening because you can audit the code. And if you can't audit the code, stay the fuck away from it, right? If the code's not open source or I can't view any of the code, there's no way in hell I'm going to buy the token or invest anything into it. Like, just DOA, dead on arrival in that context. So regulation will be interesting, and the regulators will want to regulate because they want to maintain power. Surprise, surprise, surprise.
Right.
But in the long run, they won't really actually need to do it. I mean, in my opinion, with the U.S. government's role in like regulation within crypto should not be about regulating crypto, but rather they should study individual projects and then publicly say, we've looked at this project and we feel it's safe. That's it. That's all they need to do to assure the American people that this particular project, the way that it's designed and implemented, the economics, who has access to what, the centralization aspect to it, like all those things are accounted for, verified, and audited. And if the US government feels that this protocol, let's just say Aave, for example, like Aave secure, right? There's no master key to it, and there's no rug pulling capabilities, right? There's no way to like mess it over in any reasonable way. It's been around for a long time. Same thing, Compound, right? Good DeFi platforms. You don't need to regulate Aave or Compound. They already regulate themselves, but it's just by not having mechanisms to fuck over people, right? And so the only thing the US government needs to do is just say, we've studied, Aave and Thorchain and whatever else it is, and just say like, this one's good. You can go, this is a safe protocol. Put your money into it. That's fine.
No idea too, because then you could just steer people away from whatever isn't safe. And now I guess this brings up another really interesting point. Or interesting talking point. So I feel like, and it's very unfortunate because when there's one bad actor or maybe just a team that just were in a very difficult position, maybe they had the best intentions and make a difficult choice, it looks bad, unfortunately, on the entire space of DeFi. Out of curiosity, so we saw how Solend had one whale wallet that was lending an absurd amount of money and was close to liquidation, and that liquidation itself could have apparently crashed Solana. So just, I guess my next question for you is, you mentioned Compound, you mentioned Aave. Do you think that most DeFi platforms kind of follow that standard that you just mentioned, where someone might say, hey, this is safe? Or do you think that there are these potentially fake DeFi, faux
Oh,
DeFi platforms?
the vast majority are fake DeFi. No matter how you cut it, like whether you talk about, even if you talk about Silicon Valley, 95% of projects in Silicon Valley, like companies, go bankrupt, right? They die. That's just how it works. Even if you talk about species on the planet Earth, 97% of all species on planet Earth are extinct. It's just what it is, right? Like it's common to see when you have a free market where people can enter and leave as they see fit and then experiment and try new things and whatever, like as nature does with animals, and which, Silicon Valley does with, various tech startups, and what, myself and other people in the DeFi space are building the DeFi space. They're all more or less the same thing of just like trying out different ideas and things. Some things are successful and some things are not successful, right? Mm-hmm. And so in the Solend kind of example, well, there's a host of reasons of why that becomes problematic. I mean, like the coin distribution of the Sol token is not that distributed relative to something like Bitcoin's, which is highly distributed, right? Like just how many people actually hold a token? What is the what's called the Pareto curve, or like the what's that kind of curvature? If you organize it like the biggest whales to the smallest shrimps, like what does that curve look like? And you want that curve to be, to be even out relatively. You're never going to get it even. Like that's never going to happen. But like you want to be a nice curve to it, and I don't think Solana has that nice curve to it. So that creates that potential of like single individuals having so much capital they can actually cause significant damage. And I think like in Solana's case, like if I'm not mistaken, like there's only like the vote was down to like 1%. Like only like 1% of holders, of governance token holders, like actually voted. Right. And so you had a very small minority kind of push around the other 99%, right? To like determine the outcome. And there was really just like one whale, if I'm not mistaken, that actually did like the majority of the voting within that 1%, which more than likely was like the guys behind Solend or the guys behind Solana itself, like, or the VCs or something like this, like trying to protect the protocol from a collapse. Like the price is already collapsing as it is because the market's, going through some macro things. But like to add that on top of it, where it's been, would have been quite disastrous, right? And so,
right,
it's likely. I'm pontificating here, so please take it as so. But
no,
like,
no, it's okay.
But like, it's likely to be one of those people because they're the ones that are mostly, highly invested into the asset more than anybody else probably, and they don't want to see it tank another 50% or something because of this whole liquidation of this particular dude, right? But that's problematic of the design of Solend, that the fact that 1% of people can determine what's going to happen for the protocol, right? Like you can't do that in Bitcoin. You can't have 1% of the mining power of Bitcoin make a change. Right. No, you need 51%. You actually need to reach an actual consensus to make a change on Bitcoin. That's how this shit should work, right? And the same thing with Thorchain's case. You need a 2/3 majority of the validators to make a change. You need a consensus. You can't just have one person, one gigantic whale make a determination for everybody else. No, you need the entire network as a collective to come together in a supermajority way to determine what's going to happen next. That's the way governance should work. But like, unfortunately, Solend does something differently, and we've shown its colors now why that is, inherently problematic, right? But I'm okay with it to a certain extent because in the end, it's just Darwinism again, right? It's either going to sink or it's going to swim. And if it sinks, it sinks. If it swims, it swims. And like the free market will determine the things that are inefficient and determine what things are efficient and go the efficient route. It just there's no other way that the free market can operate. Really.
No, and I think that's a really good point. I think one thing I do like about cryptocurrency so much is that you can trade 24 hours a day. You can access these platforms at any point. You are your own gainer and also your own loser, though. So keep that in mind. Reminder: everything in this conversation is not financial advice. Everything we say, it's just two guys on the internet. One of them is a professional. The other one's an idiot on YouTube. So just keep that in mind. All right. Anyways. So I got a few more questions. So I think there's been maybe some confusion between ChaosNet and mainnet. Sure. I think what does mainnet mean for Thorchain going forward? And my question after that is, actually I got two questions after that. There's the delay of ThorFi. I was hoping you could go into that. I remember when I first chatted with you, you were like, should we tell them? I didn't see the tweet earlier, but I'm not heartbroken.
Yeah,
But I'd love to know a little bit about that. And then
sure.
finally, and this might be the toughest question, I was hoping you could elaborate on the future of Thorchain and planned obsolescence. What does that
Sure.
actually mean for Thorchain?
Sure. Okay. So mainnet, what does that mean? So when we launched Signal Chain ChaosNet, like over 2 years ago, right? That to me was like the alpha, right? Not even beta yet. We're in the alpha mode. We're just going to launch this thing. We're going to prove to the community that we've actually are shipping something, and we're not just like, blowing smoke up their asses. And we're going to test out some of the economic designs and ideas, like how effective is the slip-based fee model, for example, right? And can we get a decentralized group of individuals, of anon individuals, to operate together to run a network, right? Like these basic kind of questions we wanted to, like, the only way you can find an answer to them is just like throwing it out in the wild and see if it sinks, seeing if it swims, and then adjusting as you need to, right? That was what we called Single Chain ChaosNet. I know once we were done with that we did it for about a year. We kind of migrated what I call beta or ChaosNet, which is multi-chain ChaosNet, right? Where we just did the same thing, but we launched with 5 different blockchains instead of just one. And we had like our own native token, a bunch of other changes we made as well. But just further down that kind of path of like maturity, right? You had alpha, and you had your beta, and now we're getting into our production now, or mainnet, right? And what that means to me is that like we've now launched the protocol. We've proven that it works. We've delivered the white paper, right? And some, I should actually say, like most time people, when they deliver something in this space, it's like not quite the white paper. It's like a little bit, they promise a unicorn, they deliver a donkey. In this case, it was the opposite. We actually provided more than we actually said we would from that white paper. We've proven the technology works. We've proven that it can be cryptographically secured, all that kind of stuff. We spent a year just kind of ironing out the kinks, details, edge cases, the problems here and there, and just kind of chugging along. And now we feel like when we hit this mainnet label, how I feel about it at least, is that we're now ready to scale and for adoption. We go out of the just proving it works and like getting some liquidity and some trades going and that kind of stuff. Now we're going to hit like real scale, real adoption, and blow this thing up from 10 to 1,000x, right?
Wow.
That's my intention thinking about this in the near future. And so we have multiple things that's being worked on to make this happen, right? One is the single-sided yield we were talking about earlier. Like that's just to provide massive quantity to the pools, get the pools super deep. The second thing is DEX aggregation. So integrating with other DEXs and wallets and other interfaces to get more trade volume happening through the network. That's going to just scale up and have massive adoption of the platform itself. And then the third thing is like trying to figure out how to like scale the security side through light nodes or passive nodes. We're still kind of thinking about different ideas of how that can be accomplished. But that's where we focus on for the next year more than anything. Probably it's just adding more chains, adding more integrations, connecting with more wallets, connecting with more DEXs, maybe even connecting with centralized exchanges. We've had a few conversations like that in recent months. And so like actually like expanding out and becoming plugged into as many things as possible so that we become this, like, as I like to say, a fundamental pillar of infrastructure for the entire crypto industry. So that's what I feel like the next year is going to be, or maybe 2 years is going to be, is just like pushing that out, right? And getting massive adoption, massive scale. That's my intention of that process.
It's awesome. And I mean, I think it's fitting because the image behind you looks like outer space. It's almost like that's what it is. All the planets are here, and then Thorchain is just that space that's kind of holding it together and helping these things communicate.
This one right here, this is Earth. It's flat, by the way. It's not round. It's flat.
Oh,
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
So my next question is, and maybe it's just the timing. I was curious. What was ThorFi was this very ambitious idea. I don't know if there's a plan to possibly revisit it, or if it's being scrapped for single-sided staking, or if it's going to have both.
It's not scrapped. It's not scrapped. It's Thorfi is something that I've spent a lot of time on. I spent 9 or 10 months designing and developing it myself, along with others in the core team. And I'm very proud of it, and I'm very excited about it. It is offering something in DeFi that we've never seen before, that nobody's even close to touching. Like, to me, it makes DeFi as we know it today to be like an antique almost overnight. The lending design is the perfect lending design. I mean, it's got no liquidations, no interest rates. Like, that's just like the most stress-free, perfect lending design that you can actually buy a house with, or a car with that kind of design. You can't do that with a compound or an Aave. Like, it just, you would get destroyed, probably. Either you get liquidated, or you would get like massive fees all of a sudden, or interest rates, and you just be screwed. And I think everybody who was a part of like the Terra collapse, saw firsthand of just not only just the Luna token going to zero, but like cascading liquidations, and everybody losing all their money, and blah blah blah, and like how terrible that is. But having a design where you don't lose your money, you don't lose your collateral, you don't get liquidated, is desperately needed in the industry, right? Just to really define what a lending protocol should look like, not what it's been, and you use it because it's your only choice into that particular design, but a new design that is actually fundamentally different, right? It's like Elon Musk coming out with like Tesla, right? And like we're doing something the same. We're doing the same thing. We're building cars, modes of transportation, right? But we're doing it in a completely different mentality that just like completely changes the entire like paradigm of what a car even looks like, right? Or what a car should look like, right? And so for me, I see Thorfi as that. I see Thorfi as like, we've defined a new lending design, and we've defined a new algo stable. I know everybody hates algo stables now, and there's like a lot of FUD and there's a lot of piss in the pool. I
can't believe I forgot to write that as a question, but
yeah, go on.
A month ago, I wanted to ask you about that, so please go on.
What we've designed is the perfect design for an algo stable. Like, in design, we already knew about the potential failures of UST, which is why when it failed, like, there was not really much of a change we needed to make on our own design. We knew exactly how that could fail. Not that I knew that it would fail, I knew that it could fail. And we designed ours significantly different in a way that like it never breaks the peg. The peg is always maintained at all times. It is mathematically impossible to break that peg. And so by having a design like that, you never get into a situation where people like panic and freak out because the peg's never broken. In fact, not only is the peg never broken, but the peg is actually going to be a stronger peg to the dollar than UST, USDC, DAI and RAI and insert other stables. It actually is mathematically impossible for it to be a less harder peg to those assets than what it can provide. Mathematically impossible. Like, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you elaborate? Even if it's a little technical, I would love to know, because with UST it was an arbitrage opportunity essentially, and then they created a problem if one's market cap got way larger than the other.
In UST's case, the secondary market got a lot bigger than the primary market, so a little bit of like the tail wagging the dog, in a manner of speaking. That's effectively partly what I mean. It's a complex thing with a lot of moving parts, but like that's one of the components to it. In Thorchain's design, that's not the case, right? For one, there are no secondary markets, at least to start. Maybe they'll create ones years down the road, but like to start, there are no secondary markets. So there's only one place you can buy and sell, Thor USD or Tor, is on this exchange, on this protocol, right? And this protocol does not rely on arbitrage to do what arbitrage does to maintain that peg. It does not utilize arbitration or arbitrage to do it. What it does utilize is that it has assets, layer one assets, USDC and USDT and various like layer one assets underneath it all that effectively you can redeem to one-to-one, right? Even if you have Thor BDC, you can redeem that for one layer one real BDC. It doesn't matter if Rune's price is up or Rune's price is down or Rune's price is a penny. It never matters. It always redeems a one-to-one ratio between the real layer one asset at all times and scenarios, right? Now you might be saying to yourself, oh, what if, Thor BDC is, $100 million in the market cap and the pool itself is $50 million. Well, now you're under collateralized, right? That's what you might be thinking to yourself. The reality is that's actually not the case because you have an infinite supply of BDC within a liquidity pool, right? Because if you have $100 million in the Thor BDC and you have $50 million in the pool, and let's just imagine for the sake of discussion that like $10 million liquidates into real BDC. So now you have 90 here and 40 here, right? Well, what happens? Well, now the arbitrage of the layer one pool comes into play, and that 10 BDC is put right back into the pool. Now you're back at $50 million worth of BDC in the pool, but you're still at 90 here. And then take another 10 million, 10 goes out, and then comes back in, out, back in, out, back in. And so you have an infinite supply of BDC. It's not like in Luna's case where like, oh, we're backing our UST with BDC. We got like, I think it was like $3 or $6 billion worth of BDC, whatever the hell the number was. Like they don't have an infinite supply. They have a set specific static supply unless they buy more. But in Thorchain's case, because of liquidity pools, it has an infinite supply of BDC, an infinite supply of Tether, an infinite supply of USDC, infinite supply of Ethereum. Because as soon as it gets swapped out and leaves the network, arbitrage will put the Ethereum back in the network, the BDC back in the network, the Tether back into the network. That'll just naturally happen as what we've seen the network do every time someone makes a trade on this network at all. Every time. Like if you buy some BDC on Thorchain, an arbitrage bot will swap in the other direction every single time. That's just how it works. That's how liquidity pools work. That's what's been running this way for years without any problems, hesitation. Same thing with Uni, Sushi, all these things. Like they never have a problem with like, arbitrage within a liquidity pool. It's always there. It's always readily available, right? I've never seen a case where it's not. And so the network will always provide you in a one-to-one exit to some layer one asset if you're choosing. So the peg can never be broken. Even like on USDD recently depegged, right? The primary market, to my knowledge, did not depeg. It's the secondary market depegged, right? And that actually doesn't necessarily matter, to be honest with you. But people see the price change on Curve and they freak out and it causes panic and people just start dumping and this like FUD event happens, even though it's like not even based on anything. It's just based upon like same thing with like STF just went through the same process recently, right? Like people start freaking out about STF. In reality, it's perfectly fine. It's actually not a problem, but people are freaking out all because a perceived depegging on a secondary market, which the secondary markets actually don't really matter in the real world. All that really matters is the primary market, primary market to work or not. And in USD's case, the primary market broke. The secondary market broke and the primary market broke. Everything broke. The whole thing collapsed. Didn't work out so well. But in Thorchain's case, like the primary market is always healthy because it always redeems one-to-one to a layer one asset, not just redeeming to Rune or to some thing, but giving you exit liquidity to some other asset outside of Thorchain. That changes everything.
No, and I gotta say too, the real shame of UST failing is that it's incredibly important that we do have some type of stable form of value, stable coin. That isn't centralized, because obviously one of the main concerns is that someone can call Jeremy Allaire and be like, hey, I need you to blacklist a couple of these wallets, and the same thing goes for Tether. And it's nothing against them as businesses, because they're going to do what's best for their shareholders, for their employees, and if that's what they have to do, or they're going to do it. So it's extremely important that there's a decentralized stablecoin. And goddamn, yes. That was very interesting. I never thought of a
you have to remember. I feel
like I'm learning a lot. Wow.
The Thor 5's design is very different than everything else we've seen in the past, right? So I would encourage people to not like look at USD and USDN and iron and UST and like they all failed, therefore this is going to fail, right? Like that's a silly argument. That is a moronic position to take, to be honest with you, right? Like it's like saying, it's like telling Edison invented the light bulb, I think, and like he was just like, took him 1,000 tries of different metals. He didn't just because the first 10 didn't work out so well doesn't mean that it doesn't work at all. You just found 10 ways that don't work, right? And so like we learn things from, even in iron's case, it failed because there was a whales dumped and the price oracle was delayed. And so that you couldn't arbitrage back to $1, right? So we learned price oracles are problematic within the context. You need lifetime data. Where you can't do this on a delay because it creates problems and the whole thing can cycle itself down to zero, right? We learned things about business cash. We learned things about ESD. We learned things about UST. We learned things about all these different protocols, and they all do things slightly different. And we watch how they fail and why they fail, and we take notes and we understand it. We study it, and then we make changes in implementation to allow us to improve on the problem design. Like this is what technology is all about, my friends. Like you try things and things don't work out. Success is oftentimes a terrible teacher. Failure is a fantastic teacher. We can learn lots of things from failures. And so we have to like iterate and change and improve and get better. Like this is what we do when we innovate, man. This is like everything that I build is based upon things that other people built before me, right? Right. Including the failures, the successes and the failures. I've learned a lot from people who were successful and who failed. And I continue to learn from those people, right? And people should be learning from me. Like when I'm successful or when I make a failure, the rest of the community should study what I'm doing and understand why I succeeded or why I failed and help them, inform them about the correct way of moving forward, right? So Thorchain in its design of like Thorify in general, but even specifically in the algo stable concept, is that we've studied in great detail how those things failed and why they failed. And we've made a design decisions that protect us from those failure cases and scenarios. And we've ensured that the peg cannot be broken, because if the peg breaks, people freak out and panic, and it just like becomes a problem scenario. But if you never break the peg, you never run into a situation, right?
Of course. Now, my next question, I wanted to ask you, I feel like there's a lot of confusion too, and I'm sure you've seen that as a running theme here. I read till my eyes were melting out of my skull to come up with all these questions. Anyhow, I wanted to ask you, I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on planned obsolescence and kind of the future of Thorchain once that's reached. As I understand it, it's going to be a community-driven project moving forward, and I was hoping you could touch on that.
Yeah, sure. So, building a DeFi protocol and like designing it, innovating it, constructing it, delivering it takes one set of skills. Scaling and adoption of a protocol is a completely different beast, right? It requires a completely different set of skill sets and talents, right? So it's not very common that a person who does the first part is really good at the second part. Sometimes people are, right? There are people out there who are, but not everybody is, right? And I would argue that myself, I am not very good at the whole scaling and adoption thing, right? So that's just not where my skill sets lie personally, or for the most part, most of the team, to be honest. Like we designed this, the core team was originally designed to innovate and create something very difficult and complex and ambitious. And we didn't hire on the idea of like, oh, who's going to scale it? We weren't worried about scaling. We were worried about actually accomplishing the task and delivering what we said we were going to deliver. So planned obsolescence is all about like saying that we've built what we were going to build. We've delivered what we promised we were going to deliver. And I think we've done that quite successfully thus far. And now we're going to hand it off to a different kind of class of people who have a different skill set than the kind of OG dev team to take it the next round. And I think so, like Gavin over at 9 Realms and the 9 Realms team in general, they're very well positioned for this. Like they come, their background comes with this mentality, right? Like the
Mhm.
CTO of a Nine Realms worked for Facebook for like 7 or 8 years or something like this, right? Like he knows how to take a very solid piece of code, which what Facebook is in many respects, and like keep it chugging along, right? To keep it, have good best practices and moving more slowly and like, and more cautiously. Whereas for myself in the earliest days, I'm just like, let's get this thing out here. Let's like clear up the storm and like I spent an absorbent amount of hours working on this stuff and just like being mega fingers and just like pumping out code like crazy, which makes sense in the early days. It does not make sense once you got like a multi-billion-dollar platform. Like you don't want to do that. You don't want to be running be that fast anymore. So that team is I think largely going to be taking over the project, and the plan obsolescence is that myself and other kind of OG people was stepping back. We're not dying. We're not going away. Like we're still around, and we're available for comment and question and advice and blah blah blah. Like it's not like we're just like the hammer's coming down. We're just like gone. We're never going to talk about it again. We're readily available to the Nine Realms team if they have questions or want some input on this or that or blah blah whatever. I'll still be reviewing code changes and the PRs myself, like even after PO. So that's just all part of the process of like you need a different class of person, and that's true with like even within Bitcoin. Like Satoshi did this, right? Satoshi had the original idea and concept and delivered Bitcoin, and once it got to a certain stage, like didn't really need Satoshi anymore. He didn't really need his insight or his vision or his ingenuity anymore because he'd already delivered the thing, signed, sealed, and delivered, right? And Thorchain's getting closer to that point, right? We need a DEX aggregation, we need the single-sided yield, possibly passive nodes, and possibly ThorFi. And outside of those 4 things, I'm not sure else we can deliver. Maybe order books, possibly. I don't know. But like at some point in the nearest future, it's going to be, the code's going to be more or less complete. I mean, there's still going to be bugs and improvements to be made and all that kind of stuff. Like that'll always be true. That'll be true 10 years from now. But fundamentally, the kind of core structure is getting close to being solidified and ossified.
I see. And I do have to say, by the way, I love how honest you've been this entire interview. I'm trying to think. We have 2 members here right now. Nico, Pablo, are you back there? Are you alive?
I'm here.
Excellent. Before we continue, I wanted to ask, do either of you have any questions? Oh, we have a technical error.
No, I don't have a question.
Right on. Hey, well, I guess in closing, Chad, I just wanted to say thank you so much for giving us your time. It means a lot to me, especially as a Thor bull through and through. And I'm very excited for the future of the project, ThorFi, Tor, all of it. And I think what you do is extremely important. We need to be able to access these. And I'm glad a lot of centralized exchanges are carrying native rune. For anyone watching, KuCoin, Kraken, forgetting one more, Binance.
More coming, I'm sure.
Huh?
I think Nexo is doing it too. I think Nexo announced as well.
Nexo as well. Excuse me, and
it's a European one.
I'm glad that they're recognizing the value of having an alternative. Which I think is a lot.
Yeah.
So I look forward to the future. I look forward to a conversation between you and Vitalik. That would be awesome.
I would love to see that happen, by the way. That was so much fun if I get to sit down with him for an hour, just like pick his brain. And that'd be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah. I enjoy some of his philosophical banter, even the stuff outside of crypto. He's just an absolutely brilliant individual. So hopefully maybe one day on this YouTube channel too.
If you get Vitalik on here, you call me back. I'll be happy to come back.
Hey, of course. And hey, again, thank you so much for your time. By the way, I almost forgot. I don't know if you can hear that.
Yeah, is this your like theme song?
This is the outro theme song.
There we go.
There we go. Anyways, for everyone watching, thank you so much for your time. Subscribe, like Degenerates for a Brighter Future. If you enjoyed this content, follow us on Twitter. If you haven't already, follow Thorchain, follow Chad Barraford, follow ThorSwap. Unbelievable content coming out all the time. Thank you all so much for your support. Thank you so much, Chad. I hope I see you again.
Thank you so much. I'll see you again, I'm sure.
Alrighty, have a good one. Cheers.
Cheers.